Great. I think let's begin. So, good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to Kaleidoscope Trust's 2025 virtual event commemorating the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. Ida Hobbit. My name is Alex Farrow. I use he/him pronouns. I am Chief Executive here at Kaleidoscope Trust. And for those who don't know us, KT, Kaleidoscope Trust, is the UK's largest organisation focusing on global LGBTI rights, fighting for a world that is free, safe, and equal for all. Don't mind the screen as people seem to join and not join. A little bit of some technical challenges with our panelist link versus the kind of wider audience link. But we have on the screen our main panelists for this afternoon, or this morning, or this evening, depending on where you are joining from. It's an honor for me to be moderating today's conversation, and I just want to thank you all for joining this session, both our panelists and kind of audience members, as we mark this powerful moment of reflection and solidarity, something I'm going to come back to in a moment. But before we begin, some housekeeping arrangements. So this event is being recorded. It is a public event with a global audience. And so this event will, I'm sure, be made available on our YouTube channel and on our website after today. Only being recorded are the panelists on screen. So if you are watching, there's nothing that will be shared publicly if you are kind of watching this as an audience member. The chat functionality will be, I think, open to everyone. I think we might just be turning it on as I speak. Feel free to use this space to introduce yourself, connect with others, perhaps tell us your name, your organisation that you might be from, where in the world you are, and perhaps a little bit about why you have joined this session today. Please do keep this as a safe space, so it's respectful throughout the session. As a public event, we welcome challenge and disagreement with the things that our panelists might be saying, but we will not tolerate, either in the chat or in the questions, any form of discrimination or abuse, and we will remove anyone who kind of challenges and goes against that. We also will have, at the kind of second part of today's session, a Q&A with our panelists, and the Q&A functionality is available. So if you have a question for either one of our panelists or a more general question, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a small little icon that says Q&A. You can use that functionality to type as a message, type as a question, and we will ask those questions. I will read those questions out to our panelists in the second half of this session. It looks like the chat functionality hopefully is now working, so please do say hello to everyone in the chat. This year, Ida Hobbit turns 20. And what began as a grassroots movement to honour the World Health Organization's decision to depathologize homosexuality in 1990 and trans identities in 2018, so 28 years later. This has become a global day of defiance against the violence, exclusion, and systemic injustice that LGBTI communities and kind of human rights defenders face on a daily basis. But this year's theme also takes on a kind of new urgency, because around the world, we are seeing coordinated efforts to roll back the rights and freedoms and protections of LGBTI people. Now, these attacks are not random. They are strategic, they are well-funded, and they are deeply connected to broader efforts to erode democracy, divide societies, remove and reduce civic space, and threaten the rule of law. And that's why this year's emphasis of Ida Hobbit is on the power of communities. And it is, I think, recognizing and in some parts celebrating, but also calling us to action when it comes to responding to this new global environment, and will call us to new strategies, new coalitions not only to defend the rights that we have, but also to defend the kind of democratic values and principles that also underpin them. Now, make no mistake, we are facing what we are facing is not just a backlash against identities. It is a threat to open societies themselves. We are witnessing authoritarian leaders using misogyny, homophobia, transphobia as political tools through propaganda laws, bans on advocacy, attacks on fundamental freedoms to divide societies, undermine democracy, and weaken international institutions, all for kind of malign intent. And while these attacks target the LGBTI communities with the edge of that sword, if you like, they signal something even bigger. This slow corrosion of human rights and protections for all. It might be LGBTI communities that are most threatened, that are on the front pages of newspapers, that are on the receiving end of attacks in parliaments or on the streets, but it is everyone who is affected by the many kind of things that I have spoken about when that comes to pass. Now, in the face of this, our work must become bolder, it must become more interconnected, and it must become even more strategic. And that is why conversations like today really matter. So to understand this new global moment that we are in, to share insights from different regions and sectors, and to strengthen the ties that make international solidarity possible and powerful, I'm thrilled to be joined by three extraordinary speakers who bring deep experience, kind of critical thinking, and a fierce commitment to this work. I'll introduce them all in turn. Douglas Janoff, diplomat, researcher, author of Queer Diplomacy, whose work has broken new ground in understanding the multilateral spaces, the kind of international institutions and how LGBT rights plus diplomacy can be effective. I joined Kaleidoscope Trust a year ago as chief exec, and Eve, second panelist, has been an absolute staple of my first year as chief exec here. Eve, I'd met you on my first day at the Kaleidoscope Trust office in London, and I'm thrilled, Eve, that you, an activist, journalist, and executive coordinator at Galc Plus in Kenya, are joining us as Galc Plus on the frontline advocacy organizations in both the kind of national context in Kenya, but also playing a pivotal role regionally and internationally. And Eve, your role alongside me also on the Commonwealth Equality Network as Eve as vice chair of the network. And finally, our third speaker, Midnight Punkase Tuatana, executive director at APCOM Foundation in Bangkok, who leads kind of pioneering work advancing health, rights and well-being for LGBTI communities across the Asia-Pacific region, and both working nationally, regionally, but also deeply embedded in many of the international spaces, part of the Commonwealth Equality Network as well, but also in spaces at the United Nations and other international bodies. So if we were in person, I would be asking our audience now to be giving our three panelists a big round of applause. We don't get that luxury by being on Zoom, but I think I'll just give you a little clap and a click, just so we feel some of the love that I'm sure our attendees are kind of outpouring. So with that kind of introduction done, let us begin. For this first section, I'm going to ask each of our panelists in turn a question. They have been given 8 minutes, no more, no less than the 8 minutes to kind of introduce themselves, but also to reflect on the question. And then after we've gone through this round of questions and discussion, we will then open it up to questions from the audience. So please don't save your questions until the very end. Do ask them from the very beginning, so we can also curate the conversation for the second part. Douglas, turning to you first, based on your experience as a diplomat with a kind of long-standing experience in Canada and internationally, how do you see the role of multilateral institutions, the UN, the World Bank, the EU, the Commonwealth, evolving either as a mechanism of defense or neglect, or perhaps even an active anti-rights actor. How do you see that changing when it comes to LGBTI rights? What opportunities or challenges do you think remain or that we need to seize in queering foreign policy within the systems that we have for many decades kind of been working within? Douglas, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for that introduction and for organizing the this event. I think it's great to bring together these diverse voices and greetings from Mexico City. It's morning, so I've been clutching my coffee very early. It's very early in the morning here for me. I'm at a conference, and in fact, I'm spending a lot more of my time now really delving into some of the issues that I discussed in my book, which was published in 2022. It's called Queer Diplomacy, Homophobia, Human Rights, and basically it's about the multilateral LGBT human rights space and how Western countries allied with other countries have attempted to promote LGBT rights on the global stage, and how other countries within the multilateral space have pushed back those rights. I have a website that I'm just putting into the notes here, queerdiplomacy.com. If you want more information on it, it sort of goes into much more detail. And in 8 minutes, of course, I don't have time to focus on that. I wanted to focus on the final part of the book, which is really about recommendations. And what I'm doing is I'm sifting through all the interviews that I had with civil society organizations, with UN human rights experts, and with diplomats from various countries around the world who have been working to promote LGBT human rights. So I'm not, although my title says that I work for Canada's Foreign Ministry, this is really not about Canada's foreign policy, and I don't pretend to talk about that. It's really a meta-analysis of how LGBT rights has emerged in the rest of the world. Now, having said that, I want to focus on a couple of different areas. So one general area that I focused the recommendations on were the best practices for LGBT human rights in the international multilateral space. And the second was the challenges for the LGBTQ movement. So I'm going to just touch on a few of these issues, and if some of them resonate for you, or if you don't agree, or if you're not clear on them, maybe we can discuss more of this in the question period, or hopefully this will spark some sort of exchange. But I guess in the best practices, I'm talking about how, and just to go back to Alex's main point about this new global moment where there are so many challenges and pushbacks against the LGBT human rights movement. I mean, it is a new moment when it comes to the scope of our LGBTQ movement internationally now. That is historic. But what has, for me, been old wine in a new bottle is this constant pushback, rollback. If you're a historian, if you look at what happened in Germany in the 1920s, if you look at what happened in the United States in the 1970s, and what happened in Canada in the 1980s, I could go on and on and on. Especially with the after the AIDS pandemic in Western countries and the backlashes, I think we need to go back, talk to those older people that started, in movements like me as activists at an earlier time, and look at some of those, uh, frankly, some of the mistakes that were made and some of the great accomplishments we were able to achieve. Now it's a completely different world. We're in a virtual world where we have to find ways to link up. And I think through organizations like Kaleidoscope Trust, we're doing that. So a couple of things that I would touch on would be things like I know that there's a focus on UN and international organizations, but I just wanted to remind people that there are also regional organizations where litigation can take place, where a lot of awareness building can take place in spaces, like in the European Court of Human Rights, in the Africa Court of Human and People's Rights, in the Americas, and there's the Organization of American States. So there are also regional spaces that I think activists need to be thinking about in terms of raising visibility of their efforts. I would say also there's ways to think about participation that internationally in these organizations where it's not just human rights, but it's actually looking at international labor rights, looking at crime organizations, looking at all these different ways that the you know the issue of LGBTQ rights is raised. There's also diplomatic cooperation that can take place between grassroots organizations and diplomats and international organizations, but at a more local level where that benefit is coming up. So maybe just quickly a couple of provocative questions that I can be throwing out there for you to think about would be, do we need to sort of think more about implementation, and how do you spend so much energy at these UN forums, working on resolutions, working on statements, but after that statement is made, where is that implementation taking place? And I would really like to hear from you about this major question of, do activists spend the precious time and resources that they have in boardrooms fighting over, the language in a paragraph, or are you using those precious resources to work more locally? I guess the other thing is to think about alliances with the sexual and reproductive rights organizations. I noticed there was a bit of a disconnect there, and also things like evidence-based research and how we define LGBT rights is really going to make a big difference in terms of what we choose to prioritize. Because don't forget, we all have limited resources. And so if we really need to find some sort of common language and common way of measuring the crises that are taking place in the world. And maybe if we can, instead of trying to do everything all the time, if there's a way that activists can find a way to prioritize, then that would go a long way to channeling the creativity and the energy and the anger, frankly, of many activists.
So
I don't
thank
know.
you.
Have I hit the 8 minutes?
You hit the 8 minutes I think those provocative questions were really useful for us to come back to in the main bit of the discussion. So thank you. I think it's not quite from 1912, but that historical perspective that you were reflecting on, I think, is really being seen and lived in places like Kenya at the moment, and it kind of is a a really useful link to hear directly now from Eve, because Eve, Kenya at the moment is really, it's the center of quite a lot of the kind of national backlash and rollback when it comes to rights for kind of the LGBTI community, but also worryingly becoming a center point for the international convenings of some of the kind of global anti-rights kind of movement and actors. So two bits of this question for you, Eve, and kind of answer whichever one feels most best at this point. We can come back to the second bit in the later discussion. But Eve, you've been one of the kind of leading voices for equality and justice across the Commonwealth, and Gout Plus's kind of work in Kenya is a truly remarkable example of resilience, particularly at the moment. In a region and increasingly in a nation where organizing kind of activism campaigning carries real personal risk, how has the global anti-rights backlash changed the reality for you, for your team, for Gout Plus? I guess both in terms of the daily challenges or the kind of the realities kind of immediately, but also a bit of the strategic bit. Like how do you respond knowing that that is the threat that you are now having to deal with in front of you?
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for hosting this, for the introduction, and for having us here today. And your questions hit home, right? Especially right now, Nairobi is coming, or we're just getting out of a situation where the hate conference, as we are calling it, or referring it to it as, was held just a couple of weeks here. And the aftermath of that, right? What does that do? And I love the question you asked about what has that changed for us, right? So the first thing I have to say, and if my team are on the call, they would want for me to highlight this, is the heightened security risk. We have become a country now where LGBTQ plus people are walking around in a constant state of fear. We have had to do a lot of mitigation, not just on our personal selves as human rights defenders, but for our communities and for our organizing. The first thing I'll mention is around security is that in the past, the coalition was not doing implementation or like direct service provision, but now we are forced to do security response, right? So this shows you that even the focus of our organization had to change in order to respond to the times that we are currently living in. This has also meant that time has been taken away from us. The amount of time that we now have to spend thinking and plotting and strategizing and responding to the amount of hate that we're receiving from the anti-rights and anti-gender and all the hateful people that have gained traction and ground in our country currently has been enormous, right? And we move from one strategy meeting to the next and to the next and to the next. And when activists or movement leaders or people like Gout Plus, who we are the coalition and our members look to us for direction, when we are all engulfed into the security response mindset, it means that we have little time to dream, we have little time to thrive, we have little time to create moments of joy for ourselves and for our community, which is very important, right? As queer people, we can't just be existing in this hyper-vigilant, hyper-responsive, constantly on edge, because that not only takes a toll on the body of the people doing the work, but it also takes a toll on the movement, right? So we have a situation where there's a lot of burnout. We have a lot of people leaving the movement or leaving organizing in its entirety. We have our member organizations that don't exist anymore because we're a coalition. So we are seeing the effects of the situation that we're living manifest fully in the movement and in the type of organizing that we're able to do. The other thing that we've noticed since let's say, after COVID, when the anti-rights, anti-gender movement started gaining traction, and more, so in 2023, I think, is when they actually set camp here, and they would openly and boldly show themselves as agents who are working, and they're working from Nairobi, and some of the organizations are actually registered in Kenya at the moment. What happened is a lot of our friends and allies pulled back, right? So out of either fear, out of lack of enough incentive maybe, or out of lack of commitment to the cause, we noticed that a lot of our allies pulled back. This meant that spaces that we were able to maybe I won't say infiltrate, it's a difficult word, penetrating in the past, have been closed down for us, right? We've noticed that our friends and allies have shrunk. And now, even though the ones that we have now are people that we can genuinely count on and trust, it just means that the type of work that we were able to do in the past, we are not able to do now. Kenya was looked at in the region as a place where, almost like a queer haven in Eastern Africa, where people from our neighboring countries, people from Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, would come to Nairobi, for example, as a place to seek refuge. But more and more, when Kenya in general becomes hostile, it means that the region is no longer having a safe place to go. We used to have a lot of meetings, for example, in Nairobi, where the region would come together, and the region more broadly to include Africa, so Southern Africa and Western Africa. We'd have meetings, we'd have all of this collaboration and collaborative efforts happening in Nairobi. But more and more, you see, that is not happening. So the way the anti-gender, anti-rights movement have affected countries like Uganda, where we now have an active law, affected countries like Tanzania, where activists have been forced to now completely go underground. It means that the East African movement, or what we would have called East African movement at the time, has completely been completely ruined. We used to have something that, okay, let me not even name drop, because I'd put the activists at risk if the wrong people get this message. But there were a pot of work and pots of hubs that were happening in East Africa, budding in 2019. All of that has been eroded. So we see years of work, because it's not just the work that I have been doing or my organization has been doing, but the work that we have been building on as a movement, all going away and being taken away. And finally, to respond to your question, Alex, around the effect is misinformation and disinformation. We now live in a time where the truth does not really matter. If the US elections are anything to go by, we see where being truthful is not necessarily something that is being aspired to, right? And we are known as the truth tellers, activists and liberators and human rights defenders. We pride ourselves as truth tellers. We tell the stories that are not being told, and we highlight the lives of people who have been erased or forgotten. But now we are moving into an era where that does not really matter. And so how do we counter this disinformation? So for example, in Kenya, they like saying that queerness in its entirety is foreign, or LGBTQ plus people are looked upon in Africa more broadly as an African or as foreign agents. The truth is that that is actually not true. If you look at the African history, the history of Kenyans, we've always been there, but we are moving into an era where the truth does not really matter. And so we have to find new ways to survive, right? Because truth telling might not be the way we get out of this. So to repeat what Douglas has said, they've now sent us back into boardrooms, right? We have to go back to the drawing board, because the strategies we had, the work we've done, the giants that we were standing on their shoulders, that strategy does not work anymore. So we have to rethink queer organizing in this region, queer organizing in this country, in an era where maybe what we thought was the way to liberation is not. And so we have our work cut out for us. Yeah. is how I'd like to end this.
Thank you. Thanks, Eve. It's incredibly powerful listening to you speak. And thank you for just sharing so kind of candidly. You said just such a beautiful line, this kind of little time to dream. And reminded me that it was Eleanor Roosevelt at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. She was on the chairing the drafting committee of essentially the foundational text of the United Nations. And she said, "The future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." And it just struck a chord with what you said there, Eve, because what you were describing to me, what I heard from what you were saying was that the repression is not only about the kind of physical or mental safety that you are experiencing and the team are experiencing on a kind of daily basis, that direct physical threat. It's also about suppressing this dream or this idea that we can build a world where people can love freely, can be who they are, and express that without fear. And once that repression starts to affect that dream, then actually it is much harder to sustain the will or the belief that actually we can get past this, but also a different world is possible. And it's almost a almost more dangerous position in some ways to be in. Thank you, Eve. Just as a technical point for those in the chat box, I can see that some people are putting some lovely comment in the chat box, but are putting it only to host and panelists. So we as a panelist are seeing everything, but there are a couple of recent comments that people have put in that only a few of us can see. So please, when you're putting chat messages in the chat box, do make sure that you're selecting everyone to share your message with, not just hosts and panelists. This then leads kind of on nicely to Midnight, to you. And kind of your work at AppCom has been at the forefront of connecting sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, sex characteristics, rights with kind of health and well-being, particularly across Asia Pacific. And I guess in light of this shrinking space that we see globally, and perhaps particularly if we were seeing LGBTI rights as a domain in and of itself, I think what you were connecting across Asia Pacific is seeing it through perhaps the prism or the lens of then health advocacy. So how can that remain a kind of useful entry point? Can it remain a useful entry point for broader human rights protections, but obviously particularly thinking about LGBTI rights?
Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks so much, the Kaleidoscope Trust and everyone for joining. Sawasdee krap, Midnight from AppCom based in Thailand. And as Alex mentioned, we're also a member of the Commonwealth Equality Network. We've been working in the region on particularly around the health issues since 2007. I think as Eve's mentioning around that Kenya being the hub for East Africa region, like Bangkok and Thailand is like really the hub for Asia and the Pacific, with all the development agencies, multilaterals being there. For us, it was seen as a strategic location to be based there, working across the region. And our mission is working on to improve the health, rights, and well-being of the diverse communities, and that everyone, particular communities, can achieve sustainable development in all aspects of their health, rights, and well-being. And our entry point has always been around the health side, because we know, but from our region, our governments don't respond very well to language around human rights, but they respond much better around the health side. So that has really carried through to the work that we're doing since 2007 up until now, where we just launched a new strategic plan called Relentless. And it still has the angle around the public health, being a threat to the security, to the communities, and making sure that the services will be delivered by community-led organizations for populations that we know are on the margins of society, or that governments are not supporting them on. We know from particularly the onset of the COVID-19 health crisis that the power of the community is actually about the reach, to communities themselves, how we help support each other. So that has always been our strong advocacy building the strength of our communities for solidarity building, to do advocacy, to do the evidence-based research, and utilizing that for the advocacy at the local level. So that has been like our staple in terms of APCOM's work. So we work across the region with community-based organizations. We only have like the secretariat based in Bangkok. We have 15 staff altogether, and right now I think in terms of where things are at, institutions that we've been relying on, multilaterals, are not there for us as they were previously. And we have to also look at the ways that we can connect our work with other sectors. So with APCOM's work, particularly on the social and economic inclusion, we really pivoted just before COVID-19, 2018, to work with the international bank, so the Asian Development Bank, around discussions on LGBTQI inclusion in institutions that might not have LGBT discussions previously. So I think these are things that at a local level, at a regional level, we can certainly look at influencing, or at least going to those spaces where LGBTQI discussions not been part of the conversation previously. I think as Douglas mentioned, that we have to really actively look at those spaces. And for us as a regional organization, we're also looking to connect the dots with conversations that's happening within the countries, linking that to the regional level as to global level. So it was important for us as an organization to be linked in with different networks globally to raise issues that we know from our region that don't normally get profiled at the international level, and also for us to understand how the international, I guess, the diplomacy works, or at the UN levels. So we are at this kind of like more global spaces to understand how it works, including with Douglas mentioning around like the UN spaces where we actually talk about language, and even though it's like frustrating at times, but then you realize this is the institution that we're working at, and if we cannot have our own communities being there at the table to advocate, on those languages, then I think it becomes so removed in terms of reality. So for us, it's about how do we link the regional and the country advocacy to actually the kind of like the negotiated language that we see at international diplomacy level as well. Having said that, the health side, we definitely want to do more of those, but we see that even on the health aspect, it's also being eroded in terms of the funding for particularly community organizations on the ground that are providing, for example, HIV treatment, and then for the Asia region, we at least have a lot more countries that are providing the ART from the national health budget. But what we actually lack is the prevention side. So I think this is the like a campaign that we want to also highlight in for the region, that there's a target to reach for pre-exposure prophylaxis for the region, and we're only reaching 3%, for example, because we're still relying on international funding for prevention. So we want to like use this as a way to how do we get countries, our governments, to then take on the prevention budget financing, particularly with the communities that are already reaching these marginalized communities, to then take this forward. We also think that having the communities to not just do the service delivery side, but it can also be packaged into other services as well. So for example, mental health, that can also be integrated within the communities itself, and having the expertise within the communities to provide those services. And then I think that those services can grow with the needs of the communities on the ground. Because I think people forget that we did pivot really quickly during COVID-19 to be online, to do telehealth, and then when things seem to be kind of normal, I think our government seems to forget that actually these are the things that communities can take on quickly and can continue to do so quite easily. What we found as an organization during COVID-19 in particular is that infrastructure for for financing, for funding, particularly to smaller communities to get emergencies, is not there for the Asia Pacific region. So one of our strategy for this current period is actually how do we establish this kind of like a mechanism for the region that we can then give out finances, funding to re-grant to smaller, unregistered and newer organizations that might not be based in the capital cities. So that's a kind of like the real needs that we see. Maybe this last thing to mention is that despite having, I think well, relatively a lot more funding going to health, we see that it doesn't go into the community organizations that are being institutionalized to be sustainable. So it's very much okay, funding come in to do a project, and then when the project finishes, and then that's it. There's not really building an institution within the regional organization to be sustained, and it became vulnerable, I think, to just donor priorities, and not about like how do we as a community think about what is needed for the community, and not having the investment to do things like Eve mentioned, to dream, to do things that we know our communities requires, but then it needs investment now because it takes a bit of time for you to kind of reap what you sow, basically. And when the rug gets pulled out of our feet, we just landed on our bottoms, and it's like, oh gosh, what happened? We can also blame the infrastructure that makes us that way as well. Like, how do we ensure that we, and all of us have been advocating for, flexible, long-term core funding for communities? And I think that's what we really need right now, is that how do we then build that investment into the communities for the communities to really stand on its feet, and really directing in spaces to discuss policies and where funding should go, and how that should be spent. Thank you.
Manad, thank you. I feel like you had a timer on your screen, because I think your timer went off exactly at the same time as mine. So thank you and thank you to the three panelists here. Minna, there's a technical point. People in the audience, if you have questions for our panelists, either for a specific member of the panel or a general question that you'd like us in the panel to explore, please do use the chat box functionality. You can also use the chat box if you find that easier, but the Q&A function is preferable. Minna, I just want to pick up in our kind of open questions now. One thing you've said here. One of the things that we have now been kind of reflecting on is, in a time where there's less money coming into the movement, Global Philanthropy Project, Donald Trump's President of the United States kind of announcement around US aid cuts, we're predicting $100 million less money coming into the movement this year compared to last year, and then kind of much less in future years. Now, with the removal of US aid funding, that's has been devastating, but also kind of far-reaching. One of the things, or one of the ways I think that we've talked about overcoming that, is to take this more intersectional approach. So let's think about LGBTI rights in the context of health or other domains. A worry of mine would be, in some ways, we were already doing that. And so many organizations, particularly in countries where it was perhaps a more restrictive landscape for advocacy, were receiving funds to be perhaps the provider of services, particularly around HIV and AIDS. And as part of that, were then using some of that money, either that they were able to use that money to then subsidize some of the advocacy work that they were doing underneath, even if the main thing that they were providing as an organization were kind of community services. What's the threat, do you think, to that kind of funding going forward? And I'm particularly mindful that when we did a survey at KT, but also with the Commonwealth Equality Network, a survey to kind of look at the impact of US aid funding, it was organizations that were doing that kind of community service delivery that were most impacted by the cuts from US aid. So how do you think this changes the landscape for that advocacy work to continue?
Thanks. Great question. So it's for our region, for HIV, so PEPFAR countries, they cover 13 countries in the Asia Pacific region. And that supports the community-based services, and also fundamentally it in terms of the funding actually goes to more the trans and the men who sex with men organizations and services as well. And then the global funding would do other populations. So that's how it's been I guess segmented, I suppose. So with the PEPFAR funding, USAID funding getting cut from that is the negotiation that we have to do first with the global fund. So one of the things that we are advocating for is actually making sure that the gap that has been left, actually goes to the community services from the global fund budget. So with the upcoming replenishment, we're also asking for donors and also new donors to pitch in to this mechanism to ensure that some of the gaps can also be filled. We have done some surveys also with our communities, particularly on the service side. It draws back the communities to just being like just to be the face, let's say, of conversations, and not having that the evidence-based advocacy that they could do. So, for example, services within Thailand that used to be able to do dispense pre-exposure prophylaxis, for example. So that's been rolled back. So that means then those who have been on PrEP are then not able to continue to access that at a reasonable price and for free, and now they have to kind of like buy those pills. So then that means that not many people will have the access. So it means that the work that can inform the ongoing programming. Just to give you an example on like the intersectionality between sex and also drugs with chemsex, that cannot move forward as quickly as we like to see, and the implementation and also having that expanded, more communities being able to address this upcoming issues. It also means that in spaces where the communities used to sit with the programmatic discussion for PEPFAR, it's not there anymore around like, okay, what does it need? What would be the priorities for communities? So on the PEPFAR side, so that one bit is gone. So then we have to look at, okay, what are the other spaces that allows those to happen? So we still have, global fund, but then what else are there, like other infrastructure that the community can also have that conversation with? So for APCOM, we take an active part in the UNAIDS program coordinating board in that discussion around not just the funding or not just about the program work, but actually having the face of the communities being there to do the advocacy themselves. And I mean, the connection might not be so direct, let's say, but I think if we don't have the communities actually being there at those tables, it becomes so removed with those diplomats who are there. And we have to also be aware that going forward it will be so difficult. And if we can't, as a community, stick together and be in solidarity with each other and saying the same language, saying the same messages to the people that we know will be able to make a difference, then I think we'll lose that momentum, and it will be like whoever can stay the strongest can continue the work. But in actual fact, we need everyone on board. We need to ensure that actually even our own mental health as activists, we need to also ensure that we can continue to do this work as well.
Minat, thank you. I'm going to open up this next bit of discussion around a little bit around the value, therefore, of engaging in the international spaces and the effect that those can have. I'm going to pick up with a specific question that someone has put in the chat, in the Q&A function. And Eve, if you don't mind, I'm going to come to you kind of first on this, but I'm going to broaden this out a little bit as well. The specific question is around panelist reflections on the fact that the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls was on the programme at the Pan-African Conference on Family Values. And what, if anything, this tells us about what we can expect from the UN in the coming years. And then just a little bit of extra context alongside this, we're also seeing at the UN and in other spaces our opposition using very similar tactics to things that we have pursued in the past. So if you look at the Geneva Consensus, for example, now in that declaration, bringing together countries around a declaration, but focused on perhaps restricting sexual and reproductive health rights around the world. We're seeing certain member states with set speeches trying to remove the words gender or gender equality from negotiations on international texts. Eve, what does that tell us about the international landscape that we might now be facing?
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to the person who asked this question. It is unfortunate, but I am a little bit glad that we are all starting to see these international spaces, especially spaces like the UN, for exactly what they are, right? And going a little bit back in history, I have this example from Beverly Ditsey, who was the first Black lesbian to go to the UN during the Beijing Declaration, during that time when women were first and foremost getting any type of recognition or rights at the UN level. And even then, she was mated, or they were mated by a lot of violence, right? And this has been the experience of a lot of LGBTQ plus people at the UN space. I remember my first time at the UN, and we were being prepped when we were going in. And the first things we were being told was just like, yeah, please go and do this amazing work, but also be aware that this is a violent space. And be aware that we have people here who don't like that we are here, and they will use any means and ways to either diminish what we are saying, to either counter what we are saying, or be an actual threat to us physically. So the UN has never been a friendly place, even if that is what they fronted. It has never been the most progressive of spaces. And minorities know this to heart, right? People who've done the work there know this to heart. This is not to say that the mechanism cannot be used for the good of LGBTQ plus people. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I'm just saying that the scales are finally falling off and people are starting to see these spaces for what they actually are. When we saw the name of this, let me get the exact title of theirs. They are, okay, I've missed the title. But when we saw the name on the poster and we knew that a high-ranking UN official was going to attend the conference, even though in the end we're not sure if we're not sure if they actually came, but the fact that they had given an okay and authorized for their image to be used to continue to popularize this conference, the first thought was just like, I'm actually not shocked. I'm actually not shocked that the anti-gender, anti-rights people have allies within the UN. And I'm not shocked that we have gotten to a place where they're not hiding it anymore and they are openly endorsing this rhetoric and this movement. In the past, they would hide. In the past, they wouldn't be as emboldened as they are right now, and they wouldn't declare it so publicly. So I'm thinking that when we were a bit careful with our engagements at the UN, we would be very careful with what we say and how we say it and who we are talking to, and making sure that nobody is overhearing us and nobody has infiltrated our chat groups. Now we are going to be faced by a very hostile space where now people are openly aligning either right or left, and we as minorities are being caught in the crossfire. So yeah, just to say that we are bracing for a hectic time, and the people who are doing work at the UN need to be prepared for a more openly hostile environment. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Eve. It's one kind of result of a perhaps emboldened anti-rights movement has actually been, as you said, it's bringing it's more visible, actually, people's views, because perhaps there's a greater level of confidence that they feel in those views, and actually for us brings to the surface where we have allies or where we don't, particularly then within international institutions. Douglas, I'd love to bring you into this conversation as well. So I guess same question, like what does some of this tell us about the what's going on within the UN or within other international institutions? Is it changing the level of space that we'll have? Should we be investing less time in some of these spaces as a result, or should we be there fighting over the words?
Well, I guess what I would say about the UN is that I think a lot of people like to dump on the UN because it is such a visible institution, and it is theoretically, open and available to all these voices in all these different groups and areas around the world. But like you pointed out, it's there are a lot of problems in terms of the hostility, the conflict. But let's face it, that's what the UN is. It's not just a place where people come together and share their good feelings and hug each other and support each other. It's a theater of conflict also. And this is the world that we're in. And so I think it really helps not to think of a particular institution as either good or bad or evil, but look at it as a structure that's just constantly changing depending on the people that are in there. And there are structural problems with the UN, just as there are with other organizations. But it's also a very fluid. It really, like, it's thousands and thousands of people and organizations that is constantly in flux. And sometimes you have really great programs that are managed by people who are very unhelpful or that they may oppose LGBTQ rights, but they support women's rights, and so you cannot look at this as a monolith, the UN system or the Commonwealth system. I mean, I've worked with activists and diplomats in many international organizations like Commonwealth, the Organization of American States, and they can tell me that the temperature can change from the appointment of one diplomat. Suddenly that diplomat is gone and has gone back to her home country. Another person comes in, and suddenly all these proactive and very supportive pro-LGBTQ policies have gone out the window. And it's not a perfect system. It's a very flawed system. But on the international, as an international platform, it's unfortunately all we have with the imperfections that we have. And so I think it behooves us to continue to engage with an organization and with multiple organizations that constantly disappoint us. We can't be perfectionistic about the quality of these organizations because it's the sum of its parts. However, I think where LGBTQ activists do have a say and can make a decision is in the number of resources that these organizations choose to devote to their activism. And this something came out in my research. This is something I've written about a lot in the book. And I really question the number of resources that are going into these meetings to discuss issue. It's not the content. The content is great. It's really important, but I guess I'm concerned about the mechanisms that are that this content is involved in. And I've talked to a lot of activists, and they feel like it's really important for them to get the letter, a certain letter in the definition of sexual minority in the resolution, but they may have to spend two weeks in New York in an expensive hotel, going to these meetings every day in order to get that. And my question is, the conversation needs to come back to the activists and say, is this where we want to be devoting our resources?
Thanks, Douglas. I mean, 2 weeks to change something at the UN doesn't seem too bad. I mean, for those of us operating in the Commonwealth space, it's decades to get something into a resolution. But you're right. The question there is around value, and is it, I guess, particularly in a time where we, as LGBTI organizations, are all facing less money coming in, or less reliable sources of funding as well. Things are much more expensive this year than they were 5 years ago. Where we are choosing to invest has always been important, but actually, I guess it's a moment where we're reconsidering, actually, is this space the most valuable, or do we place it in other spaces?
Or do you create your own international institutions and organizations that create that legitimacy, that create that evidence that other people are going to turn to? Like, for example, ILGA World is a good example of an international organization that has received a lot of respect, and that diplomats turn to get the latest information on the state-sponsored homophobia report and that sort of thing. So I guess it's also a question of how to channel and funnel that focus on international issues, whether you want it through the more mainstream institutions, or whether the focus is going to be more on creating queer networks.
And I think to some degree we've done some of that. Some of that work has been done, not just through the international organizations like ILGA World, but actually I'm thinking of the Equal Rights Coalition, a kind of multilateral space created as a coalition of the willing for voluntary participation of member states to come together, all committed to advancing rights and freedoms for our community. And so I guess to some degree we actually have done bits of that, both as civil society organizations, but also member states saying, do you know what, if this isn't going to be useful, we'll actually just find our own space, and we'll resource that ourselves, and we'll work with the people who and the governments who want to take this forward. But you're right there, Douglas. Also, of course, the politics can change. Those governments can change. The diplomats change. And just as the UN is this combination of individuals, of course, so are governments. And as we've seen so brutally and kind of devastatingly over the last kind of 6 months, the change of a government can have just enormous impact overnight. Another question from the chat box, a slightly different type, but picking up, I think, on this, the kind of on funding cuts, particularly from USAID. And one of the questions here is, could this serve as a wake-up call for us, about the risks of relying too heavily on external funding without building our own safety net? How can we start creating a more sustainable, self-reliant support system? Eve or Midnight, I think it would be great to hear from either of you on this. I know there have been some efforts around kind of economic empowerment and entrepreneurialism within our community as well. Would either one of you like to respond to that question?
Midnight, do
Eve.
you want me to go? Okay.
Oh, you unmuted first, so I went to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like my response will not be a direct answer to the question, but I feel like as communities, we are now faced with this question and we have to internally grapple with it. And not only as the LGBTQ plus community, but like as Africans. When this whole stop work orders and funding freeze and closing down of USAID and all of this was happening, I feel like we were forced to go back in and question the sustainability of this model as a people. And I feel like this is where the question is coming from as well. And as third world majority country people, this is the time. This is the time for us to reckon with the relationship with the West as it has been. It is really unfortunate that it has come to this, that we have to do it this way when things are really terrible, when 18% of members of Gulf Plus have shut down, when healthcare in Kenya is on its knees because a lot of it was funded by the US government. And this is the time when we are reckoning with this relationship as well. So it's really unfortunate, but I feel like this is the opportunity we have to question this, to question why our governments don't provide basic needs for its citizens, why a country like Kenya is not able to provide healthcare for its people, and what then we can do there. As the queer community, it's also a burden, right? That people who've been ostracized by their governments, and for example, if I'm talking about Kenya, people who the Kenyan government does not provide for already, and we've been forced to look elsewhere for basic needs like healthcare. We are now in a situation where even that has been taken away, right? So we are grappling in a situation where people who don't even have anything, who don't even have a means to dream about an alternative, are put in a position where we have to, right? So to respond, I can only say that we are currently in a situation where we are thinking that we're rethinking our whole we're thinking about how if NGOs are the way, if this model of working is the way we achieve freedom for LGBTQ plus people. So we are now in the process, Alex. I can't give a definitive answer, but we are going in. So then we'll be able to come out and chat our way forward. Right now we're in the thick of it. So it's a bit difficult to look at alternatives, but we are definitely rethinking not only our relationship with the West, but also the model of working around for LGBTQ plus freedom, our NGOs, the way we get there. Yeah.
Again, perhaps to add, I would
Please.
also say like our advocacy in terms of making sure that other donors understand that the need for core flexible funding and also funding that actually goes into institutionalizing the organization, including for sustainability, is also needed. One thing that we learned from the PEPFAR and USAID is the understanding that the negotiation of having the kind of overheads, I think that's been like really important because that allows organization to have that flexible funding. So rather than like, just doing the projects and then you only get funding just to do the project itself and you don't have any savings from those projects at all. I think that would be something that we have to kind of look to negotiate with other funding coming in. As an organization, we actually had a bit of a I guess self-reflection in terms of what would be our asset that we could then look at going out to other public or other businesses that can be sponsors for our work. So that has been a bit of a kind of like self-reflection, but also looking at opportunities as well in the face of the adversities. And so we have a few sort of like assets that we'd like to market a bit more around our work. That would be like forums that we bring people together, or special skills that others would like to learn from us. And then using that to market our additional source of income. The staff has been very open to those ideas. Actually, it's quite exciting. Certainly more exciting than like project implementation, where you have to do like reports ever so often and making sure that the spend is correct and has all those kind of like evidence that's needed for the audits. So I think that has changed a bit of the mood around going out and do something different. But others we've seen that the social enterprise has been like a model that other organizations have also looked into. How successful that is from the community kind of perspective. We know that if you are doing more the clinic side, I think that is a bit more successful. But now I think everyone is experimenting, and I think that's good that we see the communities branching out to other sources of funding. And then I think if we can learn from each other around like what to do and what not to do, I suppose, and inspiring each other on these kind of different modalities, I think that would help people see and dream there is an alternative way. There was a meeting with the Asia Commonwealth Equality Network in Singapore, where the communities actually rely on the volunteers, so they were able to get people who already have like their day job but want to have a gay job, and they were able to kind of like mobilize that. And I think many of the organizations that we're working with haven't really done that mobilization, or at least really doing those outreach for volunteer that you provide the space for people to come and do social work, supporting the communities. And I think we'll be surprised that there are others that like to do, but they haven't had the opportunity to do so.
I think some really interesting reflections there. We would like to build a different kind of funding model for it. We would rather have not done this in the wake of devastating and callous cuts overnight. But there are opportunities. I would think certainly corporate partnerships, certainly we at Kaleidoscope Trust, that's where we get a good chunk of our income from. And maybe those are some of the things that we should also be sharing and kind of with other organizations, as well as that kind of social enterprise model as well. Something that has come through really strongly in a piece of research that we'll be launching next month, which I'm going to talk about at the end, but around kind of how might we leverage capital investment to support LGBTI organizations so that they can get a long-term source of income rather than the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands that we're able to provide in grant funding. So different models also of kind of grant making too. We've got a kind of small chunk of time left. One question in the chat is sticking on the theme of funding, but I'm also particularly intrigued from Eve's comment around perhaps a level of distrust when it comes to, Eve, you said kind of Western funding. But the question in the chat was saying 3 major donor countries have elected new governments recently. Canada last month, Australia last month, and the UK a year ago. All 3 of those countries have been kind of big supporters of the LGBTI movement. If you were in an elevator, in a lift for 30 seconds with some of the ministers from the new governments from any of those countries, what would you be saying to them? And I feel I'm going to keep talking momentarily to give you a little bit of more thinking time. And then I'm going to go to Douglas first, because I feel like you've got a kind of more advantage because you've been a diplomat, and so, or I'm a diplomat, and so probably have your 30 seconds with the minister at any given moment. You might have something to say, and then I'll go to Eve and then Midnight. Douglas, what would you be saying if you had 30 seconds?
If I had 30 seconds with my minister to talk about LGBTQ rights, I would, I think, focus on the concrete assistance that our departments or whatever had actually had on the lives of LGBTQ people at a grassroots level. And I would be saying that this is making a difference in terms of, you know, sustainable development goals, that it cuts across issues of human security, development. It reduces poverty, increases trade opportunities, as well as the standard human rights, increase in dignity and security of people. So the point I'm trying to make, and of course I'm not, I'm paraphrasing what I would say to my minister in the elevator, but I guess this is a point that I made earlier, is that I think one of the areas that would be really helpful in sort of broadening the scope of the LGBTI movement is just moving it away from just the human rights paradigm, but talking about security, talking about talking about development, talking about business development, talking about prosperity, in many different sectors. That's sort of that would be my pitch.
Thanks, Douglas. I think a very diplomatic answer, and I'm almost hoping that Eve does not have a diplomatic answer. Eve, what would you be saying if you were in a minister with either one of the kind of from Canada, Australia, or the UK?
Thank you, Alex. Thank you. I'm hoping this is not a diplomatic answer, but I've been around diplomatic people for a minute now. They've softened me out. My gut feeling is usually to go with the human rights angle, because I'm a human rights person and that's my background. But because I have only 30 seconds and I'm with the Canadian minister, and I know right now they're pissed off about how the US has been behaving towards them, my pitch would be, there's a gap right now. There's a gap for the head of the people who've been championing human rights for LGBTQ plus people globally. It is time for Canada to fill that gap. And so that by the time the US gets out of whatever mess this is, the world will be looking at Canada as the champions and as the leaders of this, or bearing the torch, right? So I'm hoping that that would sway them, and they're angry enough at the US to fall for my pitch. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Eve. Professional, but more diplomatic than I was hoping for. Midnight, your 30 seconds.
Well, I think, I mean, all three governments can be leaders within LGBT movement globally. So that's what I would pitch to them. Continue to support with funding to community-based organizations on LGBTQI, and then at the international level, continue to champion human rights, rule of law. Yeah, I think that's what I would say.
And Midnight, just sticking with you, you have actually just come back from a series of high-level meetings in Canada with perhaps ministers or from the kind of new government. Do you have any reflections? What does it feel like immediately, having come back from some of those meetings? I guess reflecting on some of the things we've been talking about. You're fresh off a plane, still doing this kind of diplomacy. What are your experiences? What can you share?
Oh, I mean, it's really wonderful, and I have to take my hats off to the to EGAL and also Dignity Network Canada for organizing this really wonderful event, meeting with the ministers, and also taking advantage of Canada being the chair, I think, chairing the G7 as well, as a way to kind of discuss about this new renewed commitment to democracy and human rights and rule of law. That has been and to get that kind of commitment, at least the speeches have been very encouraging, let's say. And then I think recently King Charles was there, I think, to kind of look at how Canada can really step up And I think with the sentiments, as Eve said, from the Canadians, that they're very much like, yes, we are not Americans, we can be different. I think that kind of sentiment, you can really feel it, and that we can do more. That we don't need to roll back. So that was the feeling that I got. And I hope that for the UK and also for Australia as well, then they can also feel like, yeah, we can also form like a coalition together to really push this forward. And having said that, like I got invited to the so every year that there is like the diplomacy circle, particularly the UK and US used to have like a pride receptions, and this year actually the UK, Canada, EU, and Australia will be doing that together. So I think that already that coalition is forming, and I think that the more that they can do that at a country, regional, and at a global level, it really reinforces those kind of nice, like for us to feel like, oh yeah, there are still governments out there that that has interest within their work. So I would like to see more of those.
No, thank you. And as we find new spaces, coming back to what Douglas was saying around find new places to influence, the G7 and the P7 is actually a really interesting newer space for us to kind of explore. I'm going to draw this to a close, but I think that felt like a really nice way to end today's session. Thank you to all of our panelists, to Midnight, Eve and Douglas, a kind of virtual round of applause once again to you. Thank you for the work that you are doing, the partnerships that we have with you and the networks that we're part of, and for the bravery and resilience that you are all showing in different spaces as we fight for a kind of collectively different world. What I've heard today, what I'm taking away from today, is a real moment of critical reflection when it comes to our involvement and our engagement with particular international spaces. That they might still hold value, but how we might utilize them and how we can rely on them might change, because it's only people at the end of the day and it's politics, and that changes. And so a win today doesn't mean that win is going to stay, but it doesn't mean that we have to disengage. But I think the thing that I'm taking particularly from Douglas is around, but we should question how much of our time and the value, and be really clear on why are we engaging and what are the expectations that we have for that engagement. And I think if we are clearer on that, that then tells us whether we are going to make some of the right strategic choices in the months ahead. In the chat box, there has been loads of comments. Thank you to everyone who's attended. Please do click on many of the links now and save some of the really interesting things that I think people have shared in the chat box. One thing that I'm just going to finish with is that we have a really important piece of research coming out next month. Early this year, in response to the US aid cuts, Kaleidoscope Trust, we were able to secure over £600,000 in new funding from the UK government. And we were able to support 29 organisations from across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Pacific and Europe with some kind of rapid response grants to support them be able to have a bit of breathing space to kind of think and plan for the times ahead. And as part of that process, we've done a kind of semi-structured qualitative interviews with everyone to look at the challenges faced by organizations. How is the kind of current context changing and changing the ways in which they see their mission being delivered or the strategies they're pursuing, and what are the kind of long-term effects, but also what's needed next. And this piece of research will be relaunching in a couple of weeks' time, in week beginning the 9th of June. And a real seminal piece of research that will tell the story of what has happened, but also really powerful insights into what the global movement is going to need next. And so please do put that in your diaries for the weeks ahead. To finish, this is a perilous moment for our movement, and we've heard powerful testimonies, but we believe at KT that this is a setback, not a permanent rollback, and that we have been here before, and we will be here again, most likely, but we will get through it. The sands have shifted beneath us, and our response must recognize, I think, how fundamentally our global cause and the mechanisms of achieving that have altered. The optimist and the pessimist share some similarities. The optimist believes everything will be all right in the end, so it doesn't really matter what we do. And the pessimist believes that everything is going to be bad in the end anyway, so it doesn't really matter what we do. I'm hopeful. Rather than being an optimist or a pessimist, I am hopeful, because the hopeful person believes that through action, we can change things for the better. And it is that hope that calls us to act. And I think I implore you, but actually, I hope that what you take as listeners from this panel is a collective imploring to not lose hope, because I don't see a panel and sort of a kind of movement that is willing to lose that yet. But thank you for, I think, inspiring us to think about how we can do this differently. Thank you to everyone who's attended this afternoon, and have a good rest of your mornings, your afternoons, and your evenings. Thank you very much.